Hello, it's Eric Topol with Ground Truths, and I am really delighted to welcome Matt Walker, who I believe has had more impact on sleep health than anyone I know. That's reflected by the fact that he is a professor at UC Berkeley, heads up the center that he originated for human sleep science. He wrote a remarkable book back in 2017, Why We Sleep, and also we'll link to that as well as the TED Talk of 2019, Sleep is Your Superpower, with 24 million views. That's a lot of views here. Uh,
It's frightening, isn't it?
wow. Wow. So if that I think does reflect the kind of impact you were onto the sleep story sooner, earlier than anyone I know. And what I wanted to do today was kind of get to the updates, because you taught us a lot back then, and a lot of things have been happening in these years since. You're on it, of course. I think you have a podcast, Sleep Diplomat, and you're obviously continued working on the science of sleep. But maybe the first thing I'd ask you about is, in the last few years, what do you think has been are there been any real changes or breakthroughs in the field?
Yeah, I think there have been changes, and maybe we'll speak about one of them, which is the emergence of this brain cleansing system called the glymphatic system. But setting that aside for potential future discussion, I would say that there are maybe at least two fascinating areas. The first is the broader impact of sleep on much more complex human social interactions. We think of sleep at maybe the level of the cell or systems or whole scale biology or even the entire organism. We forget that a lack of sleep, or at least the evidence suggests a lack of sleep, will dislocate each other, sort of, well, one from the other. And there's been some great work by Dr. Etty Ben-Simone, for example, demonstrating that when you are sleep deprived, you become more asocial. So you basically become socially repellent. You want to withdraw, you become lonely. And what's also fascinating is that other people, even they don't know that you're sleep deprived, they rate you as being less socially sort of attractive to engage with. And after interacting with you, the sleep deprived individual, even though they don't know you're sleep deprived, they themselves walk away feeling more lonely themselves. So there is a social loneliness contagion that happens, that a sleep deprived lonely individual can have almost a viral knock on effect that causes loneliness in another well rested individual. And then that work spanned out and started to demonstrate that another impact of a lack of sleep socially is that we stop wanting to help other people. And you think, well, helping behavior that's not really very impactful. Try to tell me of any major civilization that has not risen up through human cooperation and helping. There just isn't one. Human cooperative behavior is one of our innate traits as Homo sapiens. And what they discovered is that when you are insufficiently slept, firstly, you don't wish to help other people. And you can see that at the individual level. You can see it in groups. And then there was a great study again by Dr. Etty Ben-Simone that demonstrated this at a national level. Because what she did was she looked at this wonderful manipulation of 1 hour of sleep that happens twice a year, to about 1.6 billion people. It's called daylight savings time.
Right,
And at
right.
spring, yeah, when you lose 1 hour of sleep opportunity, she looked at donations across the nation. And sure enough, there was this big dent in donation giving in the sleepy Monday and Tuesday after the clock change because of that sleep. We become less willing to empathetically and sort of selflessly help other individuals. And so to me, I think it's just a fascinating sort of area. And then the other area I think is great, and I'm sorry I'm racing forward because I get so excited, but there's work now looking at what we call genetic short sleepers. And sort of idiots like me have been out there touting the importance of somewhere between 7 to 9 hours of sleep. And, once you get less than that, and we'll perhaps speak about that, you see biological changes. But there is a subset of individuals who, and identified at least two different genes. One of them is what we call the DEC2 gene, the DEC2 gene. And it seems to allow individuals to sleep about 5 hours, maybe even a little bit less, and show no impairment whatsoever. Now, we haven't tracked these individuals across the lifespan to truly understand, does it lead to a higher mortality risk? But so far, they don't implode like you perhaps or I would do when you're limited to this anemic diet of 5 hours of sleep. They hang in there just fine. And I think philosophically what that tells me, and by the way, for people who are listening, thinking, gosh, I think I'm probably one of those people. Statistically, I think you're more likely to be struck by lightning in your lifetime than you are to have the DEG2 gene. Think about what that tells us, Eric. It tells us that there is a moment in biology, in the evolution of this thing called the sleep physiological need, that has changed such that Mother Nature has found a genetic way to zip file sleep. You can essentially compress sleep from 7 to 9 hour need down to 5 to 6 hour need. To me, that is absolutely fascinating. So now the race is on. What are the mechanisms that control this? How do we understand them? I'm sure, much to my chagrin, society would like to then say, okay, is there a pill that I can take to
Right,
basically
right.
zip file my own sleep? And then it becomes an arms race in my mind, which is then all of a sudden 6 hours becomes the new sort of 8 hours. And then everyone is saying, well, 6 hours is my need. Well, I'll go to 4 hours. And then it's this arms race of de escalation of sleep. Anyway, I'm going on and on. Does that sort of help give you a sense of sort of two of the what I feel are
Well,
fascinating areas?
absolutely. When I saw the other recent report on the short sleep, gene variant and thought about what the potential of that would be, with respect to potential drug development, or could you imagine genome editing, early in life so that you don't need any sleep? I mean, crazy stuff, but and
It is
also
amazing, but
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
sorry, go on.
No, the mechanism, of course, we have to work out, and also what you mentioned regarding the social and the behavior, engagement, all that sort of thing. It was just fascinating stuff. Now, we touched on one thing early on to come back to, the glymphatics. These channels to get rid of the waste metabolites from the brain each night, that might be considered toxic metabolites. We've learned a lot about those. And of course, there's some controversy about it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's really quite comprehensive evidence suggesting that the brain has this cleansing system, like the body has one, the lymphatic system, the brain has one, the glymphatic system, named after these glial cells that make it up. And I think there's been evidence from multiple groups across multiple different species types, from mouse models all the way up to human models, suggesting that there is a state dependent control of the brain cleansing system, which is a fancy way of saying if you are awake in light non REM, deep non REM, or perhaps you're just quiet and you're resting in your wakefulness, the glymphatic system is not switched on at the same rate across all of those different brain states. And I think the overwhelming evidence so far, using different techniques in different species from different groups, is that sleep is a preferential time. It's not an exclusive time. It's a preferential time when that brain cleansing system kicks into gear. Because as some people have, I think, argued, and you could say it's hyperbolic, but wakefulness is low level from a biochemical perspective. It's low level brain damage. And sleep is therefore your sanitary salvation to combat that, that biochemical cascade. So in other words, a better way of putting it would be, sleep is the price that you pay for wakefulness in some ways. And I think there was a recent controversial study that came out in 2022 or 2023, and they actually suggested quite the opposite. They said using their specific imaging methods, they found that the sort of clearance, the amount of cerebrospinal fluid, which is what washes through the brain to cleanse the toxins, the rate of that flow of cerebrospinal fluid was highest during wakefulness and lowest during deep non-REM sleep, the exact opposite of what others have found. Now, I think the defendants of the glymphatic sleep-dependent hypothesis pushed back and said, well, if you look at the imaging methods, firstly, they're non-standard. Secondly, they were measuring the cerebrospinal flow in an artificial way because they were actually perfusing solution through the brain rather than naturally letting it flow. And therefore, the artificial forcing of fluid changed the prototypical result you would get. And they also argued that the essentially kind of like the sampling rate, so how quickly are you taking snapshots of the cerebrospinal fluid flow, those were different and they were probably missing some of the sleep dependent slow oscillations that seem to sort of drive that pulsatile flow. Honestly, I think that paper was still very well done. And I still think there is, right now, I would still cleave to the majority of overwhelming evidence, considering it's not just from one group in one species, but across multiple species, multiple groups. Um, and I think it's nevertheless a weight of burden that is pushed back. And my sense right now, I used to think and cleave to the notion that it was a sleep expressly selective process. Now, I don't think that that's the case anymore. I think that the lymphatic system is a dynamic system, that it's always looking for the opportunity to go into cleansing mode. And you can kind of go into almost like a low battery mode when you're awake but in quiet rest. And I think that can drive some already early clearance from the brain. And then when you go into sleep, it's like powering your phone off entirely. It truly gets the chance to sort of, cleanse and reboot the biochemical system. But I think it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of work still yet to be done. It's not quite as case closed as we used to think.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's great that you straighten out the controversy because that's exactly what I was referring to. And secondly, as you also pointed out, the weight of the evidence is that it's a sleep dependent phenomena, particularly during slow wave deep sleep, is at least what I've seen.
Yes.
What's also interesting, your point about it being dynamic, what's fascinating, there was a paper in my field of cardiology. People with atrial fibrillation had less active lymphatics, less clearance, which was really interesting. And then the other finding that's also noteworthy was that Ambien made things
Yeah.
worse. What do you think about that?
I think that's really interesting. And just to come back to your point about the AFib paper, what we know is that this cleansing system in the brain does seem to track the big slow brain waves of deep slow wave sleep. But it's not only tracking the big slow brain waves. If anything, there's something to do with the cardiorespiratory cycle, the respiration rate, and the cardiac signal that may actually sync with the brain waves. And it's essentially a cardiorespiratory neurophysiological coupling, which is a lot of ways, which is to say, heart, lungs, and brain coupled together. And it's the coupling of the cardiorespiratory slow oscillations that drive these pulsatile fluid mechanical, it's literally a hydromechanical, hydro meaning cerebrospinal fluid, push and pull in and out of the system, drawing those metabolites out. So, ergo, if you have a disrupted either cardiac or respiratory or neurophysiological sort of signal, no wonder the glymphatic system isn't going to work as efficiently. I think that's a beautiful demonstration of the hemi neglect that people like me who study sleep largely from the neck upwards would miss. But if you think about, sleep is not just for the brain, it's for the body, and it's not just for the body, it's for the brain. And we're an embodied organism. We study the organism in silos: neurology, psychiatry, cardiology, respiratory, but they all interact. And so I think what's lovely about your example is the reminder that if you don't study the body in this study of the glymphatic system, you could miss out a profound explanation that parsimoniously accounts for the head scratching, I don't know why we're getting this result. Um, so that's a long way to come back to it. But the same group that was the pioneer in the discovery of the glymphatic system, led by Macon Nedergaard at the University of Rochester, She has gone on to then look to say, well, if this is a sleep-dependent process of brain cleansing during deep sleep, what about sleeping pills? Because so many people are either taking or are addicted to sleeping pills. And we've gone through we're in the era of Web 3.0 with sleeping pills. We started off Web 1.0, which were the benzos, the kind of, temazepam, diazepam, lorazepam. Then we went to Web 2.0, which was sort of the Ambiens, Zolpidem, Lunesta, Sonata. And what was common about those two classes of drugs is that they both went after something called the GABA receptor in the brain, which is this major inhibitory receptor in the brain. And essentially, they were called sedative hypnotics because they sedated your cortex. And when you take an Ambien, I'm not going to argue you're awake. You're clearly not awake, but to argue you're in naturalistic sleep, if you look at the physiology, is an equal fallacy. So they made this interesting experimental hypothesis that when you take Ambien, you sleep longer. And based on how you score deep sleep, it would seem as though Ambien increases the amount of minutes that you spend in deep sleep. But if you look at the electrical signature during that quote unquote increased deep sleep, it's not the same. Ambien takes a big bite, there's a big dent out of the very slowest of the slow brain waves. And it's the slowest of the slow brain waves that drive the glymphatic system. So what they found was that when you take Ambien or you give mice Ambien, yes, they sleep longer. They seem to have more deep sleep, but the brain cleansing mechanism seemed to be reduced by anywhere between 30 to 40%, which is counterintuitive. If you're sleeping more and you're getting more deep sleep and the glymphatic system is active during deep sleep, you should get greater cleansing of the brain. Here they found, yes, the drug increased sleep, particularly deep sleep, but it impaired the cleansing of the brain system. And so I think it's, now, have we got evidence of that in humans yet? No, we don't. I don't think it's far away, though, because there was a counter study that brings us on to Web 3.0. There's a new class of sleep medications. It's the first class of medications that I've actually been publicly advocating for. They're called the DORA's drugs, DORA small s. And they are a class of drugs, and there's 3 of them that are FDA approved right now. DORA's stands for dual orexin receptor antagonists, which means that these drugs go in there and they block the action of a chemical called orexin. What is orexin? Orexin is the volume button for wakefulness. It dials at wakefulness. So these drugs come into your system, and unlike the sedative sort of baseball bat to the cortex, which is Ambien, these drugs are much more elegant. They go down towards the brainstem and they just dial down the volume on wakefulness. And then they step back and they allow the antithesis of wakefulness to come in its place, which is this thing called naturalistic sleep. And people sleep longer. So as a scientist, you and I, perhaps skeptics, would then say, well, so you increase sleep, and I have 4 words for you. Yes, and so what? Just because you increase sleep, it doesn't mean that it's functional sleep. It could just be like, the old notion of junk DNA, that it's epiphenomenal sleep. It's not functional sleep. There was a study out of Wash U, and they took 85-year-olds and above, and they gave them one of these DORA's drugs. It's a drug called Belsomra, BEL Somra, to play on good sleep or beautiful sleep. Chemical name Suvorexant. And randomized placebo control, what they found is that when they took the drug, yes, these older adults slept longer. They had more deep sleep. But then what they did was clever. Before and after the night of sleep, they drew blood because we can now measure markers of beta amyloid and tau protein circulating in the bloodstream, which are these 2 markers of Alzheimer's disease. Why is that relevant to the glymphatic system? It's relevant because 2 of the pieces of metabolic detritus that the cleansing system washes away at night, beta amyloid and tau. And sure enough, what they found was that not only did the adults sleep longer with these sleeping medications, they also had a greater clearance of beta amyloid and tau within the bloodstream. So this was the exact opposite of the Ambien study, which was where they were seeing an impairment in the glymphatic activity. Here in humans, was a study with the Web 3.0 sleep medications, stuvorexant. Not only did it increase sleep, but it seemed to increase, well, the assumption was that it was increasing lymphatic clearance because at least as the end outcome product, there was greater clearance of beta amyloid and tau protein in the blood. So it wasn't just junk sleep, it was functional sleep. So for the first time, I'd seen a sleeping medication that increased sleep more naturalistically, but that increased sleep made you, the organism, function better the next day as a consequence. Does that make any sense, or is that
Absolutely.
convoluted?
And it's interesting that we may have a sleep medicine finally, or a class that actually is doing what is desired, right? I mean, then especially,
Yeah.
it ha this is one of the other things I was gonna ask you about is that as you pointed out, this is, an interaction throughout the organism, throughout the human being, and we've seen, studies about how sleep disrupts metabolism, and through that, of course, and even separately, um, can take down our immune system or disrupt that as well. And so one of the questions, I guess, is your thoughts about these other effects, um, because you mentioned, of course, the potential of looking at things like p-tau 217 markers or other markers for um, that would denote the status of your risk, ultimate risk for moving on to Alzheimer's disease. But there's these other factors that also play a role with sleep, um, lack of adequate sleep, and perhaps particularly sleep quality. I wonder if you could just comment about this because there's so many different systems of the body that are integrated here, and so the salutary effect that you just described with the ability to potentially see less, at least biomarkers, for what would be considered risks to ultimately develop Alzheimer's. There's also these other very important effects when we talk about um, high quality sleep, I guess, right? And maybe you could comment about that.
Yeah, I think quantity is what we've been talking about in some ways, but quality has also come onto the radar as absolutely essential. And what we find is that the quality of your sleep is as, if not more predictive of both all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, metabolic mortality, and in some regards, cancer mortality as well. And when I say quality of sleep, what we're really referring to here is at least one of two things. One is the continuity of your sleep. So you could be sleeping for 8.5 hours according to your sort of sleep tracker, but maybe you're getting 8.5 hours by spending 10 hours of time in bed because you're awake so much throughout the night and your sleep is very sort of punctured and littered with all of these awakenings across the night. That's sufficient quantity of sleep, 8.5 hours, but it's poor quality of sleep because you're spending too much time awake. And so our measure of quality of sleep typically is what we call sleep efficiency. Of the time that you're in bed, what percent of that time are you asleep? And we like to see some measure of at least 85% or above. Because once you get less than 85% in terms of your sleep quality or your sleep efficiency, then you start to see many of these unfolding system-wide impairments. You seem to have high risk of diabetes, high risk of obesity, high risk, as we said, cardiovascular disease, also hormonal changes, both in men and in women. We see upstairs in the brain with poor quality of sleep, much more so than quantity of sleep. Poor quality of sleep is a more powerful predictor of mood disturbances and psychiatric conditions. And in fact, I think if you look at the data at least in my center, in the past 23 years, we've not been able to discover a single psychiatric condition in which sleep is normal, which to me is a stunning, revelation. And what that tells us is that in many of those conditions, they do seem to be getting not too bad of quantity of sleep. What is the marker of psychiatric sleep disturbance is not short quantity, it's poor quality of sleep. So I think it's a wonderful, important point that I don't think we pay enough attention to, which is the quality.
Yes, and the other thing that you've emphasized, and I just want to reiterate to people listening or watching, that is the regularity story. Just like you said with quality, the data, and I'll put the figure in that shows the link between regularity and cardiovascular, neurodegenerative, cancer. That regularity thing, a lot of people don't understand how important that is as well.
Stunning study from data from the UK Biobank, and this is across, thousands and thousands of individuals, and they tracked quantity and they tracked regularity, and they split people up into the quartiles, those who were most regular and those who were least regular. And as you will see in the sort of the figure that you flash up, those people who were in the upper quartile of regularity de-risk all-cause mortality, cancer mortality, cardiovascular mortality. It was stunning. And then they did a cute little experiment sort of a statistical test where they took quantity, because they had it in these individuals, and regularity. And they kind of put them in the same statistical bucket and did a sort of a Coke Pepsi challenge to see which one won out.
Yeah.
And what it seemed to be was that regularity almost beat out quantity in terms of predicting all-cause mortality. Now, that's not to say that you can get away with saying, well, I sleep 4 hours a night, but I sleep very regularly, consistently 4 hours a night. No, you need both. But regularity, I was someone who, based on my remarkably vanilla and pedestrian personality, I've always been quite regular in my regard. But goodness me, even I, when I read that paper, I thought, I am doubling down on regularity. It's so important. That tells us, I think, something that is in some ways a story not about sleep. It's a story about your circadian rhythm.
Yeah.
We speak a lot, or I speak a lot about sleep, and I think I've probably done a misservice to the other aspect of the sleep wake rhythmicity, which is called your 24-hour circadian rhythm. Now, your sleep pressure, the drive to sleep, is independent of your circadian rhythm, but they often work beautifully in harmony with each other, and you fall asleep and you stay asleep. But I think the circadian system is critical because, excuse me, and what the circadian rhythm also regulates sneezing right at the inopportune moment when you're recording a podcast. But nevertheless, what that tells me is that when you feed your brain signals of wake sleep consistency, which is to say, wake sleep timing regularity, there is something about feeding the brain signals of regularity that anchor your 24-hour circadian rhythm. And as a consequence, it improves the quantity and the quality of your sleep. They're intertwined.
That's terrific explanation for what I think a lot of people don't appreciate its importance. Now, last topic about tracking. Now we understand how important sleep is. It is the superpower. I'm with you on that. And
Mhm.
you really brought that to light in so many ways. But of course, now we can track it with rings, with smartwatches, and we get these readouts, things like efficiency as part of the Aura score and other rings, and deep sleep or non-REM, REM, the works. You can see your awake times that you didn't know you're awake, and the whole bit. Do you recommend for people that aren't getting, great sleep quality, beyond that they should try to establish a regular schedule, that they should track to try to improve it? And of course, how would they improve it? Or are these things like having a cold, mattress, temperature that is controlled? What are the tricks that you would suggest for trying to improve your sleep through tracking, or do you think tracking shouldn't be done?
Oh gosh, it's such a wonderful question. And as with wonderful questions, the answer is usually it's complicated. And I have to be careful because, for someone who's currently wearing three different sleep trackers, it's going to be hard for me to answer this question completely in the negative. And there are three different sleep trackers, but I would say that for the most part, I like the idea of sleep tracking if you're sleeping well, meaning if as long as you're not suffering from insomnia. The reason is because Sleep, unlike those two other criticals of health, which is diet and exercise, is very difficult to subjectively estimate. So if I were to ask you, Eric, how many times have you worked out in the past week? You'd be able to tell me. How cleanly or how poorly have you been eating in the past week? You could tell me. But if I was to say to you, Eric, how much deep sleep did you get last Tuesday? And if you don't have a sleep tracker, you'd say, I don't know. And so there's something useful about tracking, especially a non-conscious process that I think is meaningful to many. And often in medicine, we say what gets measured gets managed. And there is that trite sort of statement. I do think that that's still true for sleep. So many people I've spoken to have, for example, markedly reduced the amount of alcohol consumption because they've been seeing the huge impact that the alcohol consumption in the evening has on their smart ring data as a consequence. So overall, I think they're pretty good. When people ask me what's the best sleep tracker, I usually say it's the one that you wear most frequently. Because if I come up with a band, headband, chest straps, all sorts of different things, and it's 100% accurate. But after 3 uses of it, you stop using it. That's a useless sleep tracker. So I like to think about sleep trackers that are low friction and no friction. When we go to sleep, we take things off. We don't put things on. That's why I like things like the Ring. For example, I think that's a non-intrusive way. I think the mattress may be as, if not better, because it's a completely frictionless device. You don't have to remember to charge it. You don't have to put it on, you just fall into bed and it tracks your sleep. So but one form factor I like to think about sleep trackers is the form factor itself, but then the other is accuracy. And I think right now, if you look at the data, probably Aura is winning the Ring kind of wars. If you look at all wristband wars, I think it's probably the most accurate relative to something like, Fitbit or Apple Watch or the Whoop band, but they're all, pretty close. But I think Aura is probably the leader in class right now, at least. Keep in mind that I used to be an advisor for Aura. I want to make that very clear. So take what I say with a grain of salt in that regard. I think to your question, well, I'll come back to mattresses in just 1 second. For people who are struggling with sleep, I think you've got to be very, very careful with sleep trackers because they can have the counterproductive effect where I gave you the example of alcohol or eating too late, and these sleep trackers help you modify your behaviors to improve your sleep. Well, there are places where these trackers can actually do you a disservice when you get so hyper focused on your data and your data not looking good each and every day. It becomes a self fulfilling prophecy of a negative spiral. And we now have a condition in sleep medicine called orthosomnia. So, ortho in medicine typically means straighten. So, you've heard of orthodontic, straightening teeth, orthopedic, straightening bones. Orthosomnia is about getting so obsessed with getting your sleep perfect and your sleep straight that it causes an insomnia like syndrome. Now, I don't know. I think the press has made more of this than there is. It probably is about 5 to 7% of the population. I would say at that moment in time, do one of two things. Either take the Ring off entirely and just say, I'm going to get my sea legs back underneath me, get some cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And when I'm confident, I'll put the Ring back on. Or don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Keep wearing the Ring. Try to say to yourself, only on, let's say, a Sunday afternoon, will I open up the app and look historically what's been happening during the past week so that you keep getting your data, but you don't get the anxiogenic daily sort of repetition of reinforcement of, I'm not sleeping well. I should also note, by the way, that I think sleep trackers are not a substitute for either a sleep recording laboratory, but also they're not a substitute for ultimately telling you entirely how good your sleep is. Don't forget, you should always keep in mind, how do I feel the next day? Because I think a lot of people will see their readiness score as 92 and they feel miserable. They just feel rough. And then another day, my readiness score was 62 and I just went out and I just ran my fastest 5 mile, that I've done in the past 6 months. So don't forget that subjective sense of sleep is just as important as objective measures of sleep. The final thing I would say to your point about the mattresses, I actually do think that they are a really great vehicle for sleep augmentation because these smart mattresses, they're filled with sensors, things like 8 Sleep, and they will assess your physiology. They will track your sleep just like a sleep tracking ring. But what's also good is that because they can manipulate temperature and your sleep is so thermoregulatory sensitive that they create this kind of, it's almost like this bent sort of arc of thermal story throughout the night because you have to warm up at the surface to cool down at the core to fall asleep. Then you have to stay cool to stay asleep. Then you have to warm up to wake up, and they take you through that natural change, but they do it intelligently because they're measuring your sleep minute to minute. And then they're saying, I'm tweaking temperature a little bit. Has sleep improved? Has it become worse? Oh, it's become better. Let's lean into that. Let's get them even colder. Oh, wait a second. It's getting worse. Let's warm it back up a little bit. It's like a staircase method, like a Richter shock. And gradually they find your sweet spot. And I think that is a really elegant system. And now they're measuring snoring perturbations, and they can augment the bed and raise the angle of the bed up just a little bit so that the gravity doesn't have as much of a hold on your airway. Because when you're lying on your back, the airway wants to collapse down to gravity. And when you raise back up again, it will change that. And so I think that there's lots of new advances in I think mattress technology that we'll see coming out into the future. I think it's a great vehicle for sleep augmentation.
That's terrific. Well, this has been for me, very educational, as I would have predicted. You're if anybody's up on everything in this area, it would be you. So, thank you, Matt. It's a really brilliant discussion, really enlightening. We could talk some more hours, but I think you've encapsulated some of the big things. And before we finish up, is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, I think just to thank you for both your work in general in terms of science and communication, your offer here specifically to allow me to try to be a very poorly communicated voice of sleep, and also just what you've done in general for, I think, the accuracy of science communication out into the public. Please never stop. Continue to be a shining light for all of us. You are remarkable. Thank you, Eric.
Oh, you're very kind, and I look forward to the next chance we get to visit in person. It's been too long, Matt, and all the best to you. Thanks for joining today.